So this is the final session of this year. We prepared 10 sessions for this academic year, and we're ending with the climate and ecological crisis, which this year we prepared 10 sessions. Sorry, that's my YouTube. Um, yeah. we're talking about this very like salient topic of the climate and ecological crisis, and also we want to end with a really like deep thinking of like what can the workers do, like what's the role of the working class movement and the trade union movement in trying to challenge the climate crisis. um, yeah. And as usual, I'd like to promote quickly that the GFTU, in partnership with SOAS Economics Department, has launched a survey for all workers in Britain and Ireland to hear about your experiences about trade unions in general and union education, and what topics of political economy you might be interested in. You don't have to be a union member to take this survey. It's open to all workers in Britain and Ireland, regardless of union membership, nationality, immigration status, or even the employment status. So if you're currently out of work, that doesn't matter. I'll type in the link in the chat. And as usual, the questions, you can ask the questions throughout the session. You don't have to wait until the second half to ask the question, but please use the Q&A box in the bottom to ask the question so that we can keep track rather than the chat box if it's a question for the speakers. I think that is everything from me, and I will. Sorry, I'm very bad at multitasking. I can only do one thing at a time. So I will type in the link to the survey and introduce Ying, today's chair, and hand over the floor to Ying. So Ying Chen is Associate Professor of Economics at the New School, and she holds a PhD in economics from University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her work explores the contradictions within capitalism and how they exhibit themselves. Topics she has studied include economic development, labor, and climate change, with a special focus on the global south. So Ying, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Honey, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. So as Honey mentioned, I teach economics at the New School for Social Research in New York, and I'm also an active organizer and participant of the SAPE lecture series. And I'm very honored to be able to host this webinar, joined by two renowned scholars, Max Ajl and John Bellamy Foster, whose scholarship I draw on significantly in my own teaching and research. I think both scholars have made really important contributions to the critical debates on ecology from the political economy perspective, and particularly on its relation with capitalism. So I think their works have significantly shaped how we understand the roots of today's climate crisis and the possibility for alternative futures. So let me say a few words about the topic before turning to our speakers today. In today's world, climate and ecological crisis is both urgent and also complex. It is happening in a global economy where production is highly fragmented, supply chains stretch across borders, and working class and union power has been significantly weakened. At the same time, capital can move production and also pollution across regions with very few constraints. So the question really becomes, what is the role of working class and in this moment? How can workers and unions respond to the environmental crisis while also protecting jobs, livelihoods, and dignity? So as Honey mentioned, each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes, and I will then raise a couple of questions for both speakers, followed by a short panel discussion of about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we have an entire 1 hour devoted to questions and answers with the audience. I know 2 hours might be a little bit long, but it gives us really a good chance for a more engaged discussion. And I want to thank you all in advance for your time and patience, and particularly to thank our speakers today. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, John Bellamy Foster, who is the editor of Monthly Review and also professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. He has written widely on political economy and has established a reputation as a major environmental sociologist. He's the author of Marx Ecology, Materialism and Nature, The Great Financial Crisis, Causes and Consequences, and The Ecological Rift, Capitalism's War on Earth, and The Theory of Monopoly Capitalism and the Elaboration of Marxian Political Economy, among many others. So John, you will have about 15 minutes to speak. The floor is yours.
Well, what I'm going to say may be a little bit disappointing in some ways because we're in a difficult period. I wanted to talk on the challenge of green labor and start from the United States, which of course is the country I'm most familiar with. And I'm pleased that this session is talking not just about the climate, but also ecological crisis, because it's important to understand that as big as the climate crisis is, there are 9 planetary boundaries, 7 of which we have now crossed. And there's a multitude of environmental problems, all of which, of course, are related to the climate, but cannot be reduced to the climate problems. So we need to look at the broader ecological terrain. In terms of green labor in the United States, or the the whole problem of labor in the United States, it's important to start out to recognize at the start that the only 6.8% of the workers in the private sector in the United States, which is of course the bulk of the economy, only 6.8% are unionized. And of course, there are public sector union workers that are unionized, but many of them are prohibited from striking. And ever since the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, and at the beginning of the Cold War, the labor's powers, its ability to strike, its various weapons have been trimmed away, and so that and over the years it's gotten worse. So labor has very restrictive power. There is basically a business unionism in the United States, and I think at the top of organized labor, the labor leadership generally, let's say within the AFL-CIO, is a, a labor aristocracy in the sense described by Lenin. The AFL-CIO has supported destroying unions, radical unions all over the world as part of the Cold War and now the new Cold War. So their role abroad has been reactionary, and the labor business unionism tends to restrict any kind of grassroots union movements, any attempt to radicalize the union movement, and it's quite corrupt and attached to the Democratic Party and so on. So even though there are a lot of things that are good about the unions, and I think everyone on the left supports union action. I mean, it's almost a definition of being on the left. Nonetheless, we have to recognize just how much it has been corrupted, how much it's business unionism. And if you believe in working class environmentalism, that can't simply be um, adherence to the unions, because most of the workers are not represented by unions, and the base of the workers' movement and the poorer workers are far more radical than the those who are at the top of the let's say labor aristocracy or labor hierarchy. So this is a problem we have. Now I wanted to mention 5 phases that have occurred, 5 phases that have developed, and maybe the possibility of a sixth in the development of green labor in the United States. The first phase, and I'm really going back to the 1980s, and it reflects my own experiences and involvement in the struggle. But the first phase can be seen as a struggle for a labor environmentalism, and really to define labor environmentalism. And the leading union in this was the oil, chemical, and atomic workers under Tony Mazzocchi, and at that time they tried to argue that the main obstacle to labor environmentalism was the job blackmail, that if there are environmental measures, environmental changes, the corporations would always say to the unions, you support this and you lose jobs. Or to individual workers, if you support this, you'll lose your job. And the job blackmail was really important. So in this period of labor environmentalism, there was a super fund that came out of the environmental movement for cleaning up pollution. The super fund that was paid out to corporations to clean up pollution, and they argued for a labor super fund to that would retrain workers, ensure that they had jobs if they were thrown out of work due to environmental changes. And this this was proposed and fought for and defeated. But the leading unions understood that you had to eliminate the job blackmail if they were going to be able to effectively take environmental actions. So that went on. Another phase that overlapped with this was the just transition, the argument for a just transition. Of course, that's still there, and within the labor movement from the 1970s to the 1990s, particularly. And this was led by the United Steelworkers Union. They're in their Our Children's Future report in 1990, and their Securing Our Children's Future report in 2006. They said that global warming was the most important issue threatening workers and their children, and tried to organize around that. And it was an enormously important move. It targeted multinational corporations. And this intersected with what we could call a third phase, which was the anti-globalization movement, symbolized in the United States most by the uprising in Seattle in November 1999. And that symbolized, actually, at the time, an alliance between labor and environmentalists against globalization. But the anti-globalization movement went down to defeat in the early 2000s, I think as a result of imperialism and war that resulted in sort of collapse. I was in South Africa in 2002 for the what was called, I mean, it was the world's a World Conference on Sustainable Development, I think it was called, but it was supposed to be the second Earth summit, and we were we, there were unions and environmentalists were involved, and for a lot of people, it was very hopeful. I was more critical of what was going on. But while we were there, um, George W. Bush indicated that he was going to invade Iraq. And the environmental movement kind of receded in the United States in the face of war, the anti-globalization movement. The next phase was the Green New Deal. And the term Green New Deal had been around for a long time. And it was it you know it was actually even proposed by Obama in his election, in his first election to his first term. But once he came into office, he dropped it, and it was circulating in business circles. But then it was taken up by radicals, and the Green New Deal became an organizing point. And of course, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders and others, and basically the left was behind the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal was really a notion of a green Keynesianism, promoting the economy by promoting green jobs, putting a lot of money into the environment and producing jobs at the same time, and economic growth. And people like Robert Pollin, who I've known for a long time, he argued that that it was possible to have absolute decarbonization, not just relative decarbonization, and that there was no problem with economic growth, even in the United States and the environment, even in a wealthy country, the United States and the environment. And the U.S. could both expand its economy and clean up the environment. Of course, that meant reducing the environmental problem to the climate. And it was based on basically the fiction that countries were decarbonizing, let's say in Europe, when actually they were moving their production to the global south, and they were consuming the products production in the global south, and it was just the way that we calculated the carbon that made it look like progress was being made. Anyway, at the time that came out, some of us on the more radical side, the Science for the People originally came out with a notion of the People's Green New Deal, and we promoted that in Month Review, emphasizing the frontline communities, emphasizing the global South as well. And then Max, of course, wrote his book on the People's Green New Deal. And that was important. It emphasized the front lines. There was a lot going on. Most unions have climate and environmental justice resolutions. The environmental justice movement had been building up in the 1980s and the 90s. And some unions, like the Service Employees International Union, which has a lot of hospital workers, have been very good on environmental struggles. Some of the Amazon worker struggles. There was an emphasis on green collar workers, and a lot of this was in the context of green Keynesianism and economic growth, and so there are parts of it that conflicted with any kind of comprehensive environmental strategy, but it was nonetheless progress. And there was even the promotion of green energy jobs, and the I think my clock has stopped here, so I'm not sure about the time. But anyway, the promotion of green energy jobs, which were increasing until about well, they were increasing until about 2023, not counting the COVID period, and but then they've the rate of increase has declined. There was Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which was mostly a farce, but did represent some movement in the direction of green Keynesianism. But that has all collapsed. And there's no talk really of the Green New Deal anymore, or even a People's Green New Deal, which fed off of that. Not in the United States. In fact, the in the U.S., the top establishment figures like Richard Haass, who for years was head of the you know, head of U.S. in the U.S. foreign policy circles, and have declared that the end of the energy transition, the Green New Deal, was based on the energy transition to alternative energy occurring. And now they've declared last year, formally declared from the various top echelons in the United States, as well as the banks, that the energy transition is over, and the reason is because of AI. AI needs so much uh, energy and water. By 2030, it's supposed to uh, be using up about a third of the energy in the United States, and or electricity in the United States will be devoted to AI, while uh, about equivalent to the amount of electricity used in Japan or India. So it's just massive, and that's just the electricity. The water demands are enormous. So there's a fight that's emerging over AI that actually has now environmental aspects and is being led by labor unions, an attempt to pause AI in order to be able to regulate it and defend communities, the environment, and labor unions are very heavily involved in that. So that's really important. But the end of the energy transition is significant. It was declared over before the Trump administration came into power, because the powers that be in the United States realized that they couldn't even pretend to be pursuing an energy transition when they needed more and more fossil fuels, more and more of every form of energy, more nuclear, in order to feed the AI. And so, since the green movement, or the green labor movement, was based on there being an energy transition, it's sort of collapsed in that respect. And I think that there's a new struggle over AI that is going to be crucial. At the same time, in the United States, there's been a growth of socialism, but it's taken a very social democratic form, and uh, and the Democratic Socialists of America is diverse. Some of them are social democrats, some are revolutionary socialists, but the big publications, for example, like Jacobin, Catalyst, and now The Nation, which is edited by Bhaskar Sankara, who owns the other two. It's taken a very anti-environmental position, adopting what they call an eco-modernist position that just says technology is the solution, and to all of these problems, and attacking the environmental movement. So figures like, and part of it is on the and under the flag of Marxism. So some Matt Huber, for example, has done good work in talking about workers' environmentalism, but it's all oriented towards the organized labor, not workers in general. And it goes hand in hand with attacking environmentalism, attacking degrowth, and so on, denying Matt Huber and Leigh Phillips, have denied 8 of the 9 planetary boundaries. The only one they recognize is capitalism. They say that we can have infinite growth in the planet, and that Leigh Phillips argues that we can have 282 billion people on Earth or more, and which, as much as I criticize Malthusianism, I find that preposterous. And Phillips is now involved in Canada, attacking Avi Lewis and Naomi Klein and the environmental movement, trying to switch the NDP away from environmentalism and towards a workerism, which basically throws out all of the radical environmental notions. And this created a big conflict in Canada. But this is all going on. There are social democrats arguing in favor of Marxism with the environmental movement weakened, who are allying with the capitalists, eco-modernists of the Breakthrough Institute. And so it's a big mess. And on top of this, we have imperialism and the labor aristocracy. I believe that there isn't any real way to go forward except on terms of to have a really genuine environmentalism or labor environmentalism in this day and age. It has to be planetary, it has to be global, it has to be anti-imperialist. But the same publications, especially some of the same figures like Vivek Chibber, are now denying imperialism, redefining Marxist materialism in the narrowest sense, and leaving out the environment and all the various other struggles. And so we're in a really difficult state with a lot of the left going to the right, and with a neo-fascist state under MAGA and Trump, and which is also an eco-fascist state, we can say nowadays. I believe that the only answer is an anti-imperialist one, a global environmentalism. I talk in terms of the environmental proletariat, but I'm sure I'm way out of time now. So I'll
Yes,
answer
thank
questions
you.
about that if they come up.
Great.
But we do need a workers' movement, but we need to reconstitute it if we're going to have a movement that's a workers' movement that's an environmental movement out of absolute necessity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for sharing your insights and for laying out the stages of environmental movement in the United States and clarifying its relations with the labor movement and also showing its underlying structural tensions. I really look forward to raising some questions later. Let me now turn to our second speaker, Max Ajl, whose work brings these questions into the context of imperialism and the global South. A brief introduction first. Max Ajl is a senior fellow at University of Ghent and an associated researcher at Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. He is an associate editor at Agrarian South and Journal of Labor and Society, and has written for the Journal of Peasant Studies and the Review of African Political Economy. His book, A People's Green New Deal, was published in 2021 with Pluto Press. Max, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the guests for taking some time out of your afternoon or evening. I'm actually going to, which I used to never do a PowerPoint. So I will share it and talk over it or through it. It should be visible now, I believe. Sufficiently visible. In fact, I think it can be useful to orient our discussion about green transition by thinking about where, in fact, we want to go, and then thinking about how to get there, which is maybe disarmingly obvious or might seem trite or even silly, but I find it serves as a useful orienting pole for conversations where there are often presumptions in our work about convergences, about what we think about the world, rather than articulated stances about what we want to see and how to get there. And if we articulate them, then we can understand maybe where we see things differently, and then we can then think about how we can possibly converge to get to different places. And so this is a classic thing from the dialogue from Alice in Wonderland, that it really depends which way you want to go, depends on where you want to get to, right? Um, so I'm going to start there. And what is eco-socialism? That is, what is the world overall we would like to see? And it's very loose, of course, but it's a very general schematic. It's a worldwide decommodification, that is the social control over the means of production, more or less permanently sustainable patterns of production, um, worldwide developmental convergence, that is, the whole world should have the same levels of development, um, equal per capita access to energy, that is, worldwide developmental convergence rests on more or less equal access to energy, which is something very fundamental, and equal labor distribution. Right now, the third world tends to work a lot harder than the first, and the first world tends to have a much higher level of consumption than the third. That is not a just world system, and it's also a world system that's maintained by a great deal of violence. So what is the nature of our world? And again, we have very differing assumptions and analyses about what that is, which I think John was pointing to. And I would say that there's a lot of arguments internal to we can say the different camps, but there's two basic frameworks that I think are dominant. One proposal, which is associated with some but not other schools of Marxism in the West, claims that development basically is not polarized, that capitalism is basically flat, is more or less the same everywhere, or moving in the direction of being same everywhere, and tends to have a secular tendency towards worldwide polarization. A second proposal claims that development has always been, and capitalism has always been, inherently polarized from when it became a worldwide system. And so this is just a graphic of unemployment rates. And I think it takes a lot of arguing or argument or strained argumentation to actually claim that development is not polarized and polarizing. That is, it's a conclusion one can draw if one looks at most sets of aggregate data. Now,
Max, sorry to interrupt. Are you able to full screen the slides if it's okay?
I can try. Yeah, 1 second. Let me unshare full screen and okay. Visible?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. I understand the issue. I'm not that technologically adept. So this is a schematic account of the people who claim that flat capitalism, that is, capitalism is kind of iterative, that it's the same, that they argue basically that the northern industrial proletariat should be the leading class, right? Which is then an idea that's sold in the North, and that will lead to eco-socialism. And then the argument about polarized capitalism is that the semi-proletariat, that is peasants, peripheral industrial labor, third world working class women, third world women who are outside the formal labor force, would be the leading class. This is based on the theory of the weak link from Lenin. And this puts national liberation, that is the national control over the freedom of development of the productive forces, at the center of our analysis, and that this is a path to eco-socialism. Social science, or the history of the world over the last century, has made very clear that it has been in the zone, what Samir and Amin like to call the zone of storms, in which the more radical struggles in our world system occurred. And it's more or less the first world working class has not been very successful in fighting for an egalitarian world system. I mean, this is more or less an empirical truth. It's a hypothesis that's been proven by history. And if we want to change that history, we have to acknowledge the history as it happened. So, also, I mean, to talk about modern imperialism, it's basically the stage of late monopoly capitalism. And it's also important to understand that imperialism is not a question of economics and accounting. It's a sociological phenomenon. That's a phenomenon that envelops the entirety of the world system. And it's based, of course, on value flows that go from north to south, that is claims on resources, claims on labor. But it's neither is it reducible to trade, nor is it reducible merely to profit. That is, imperialism also rests on the destruction of productive infrastructure. This is very important to keep in mind because this is what we see in Palestine, Yemen, Syria, Iran, Venezuela. We see the raising of productive infrastructure as integral to the process of accumulation on a world scale. That is, there is the process of political engineering, the process of the destruction of sovereign third world states, the process of the destruction of national liberation movements is part and parcel of making sure that value can continue to flow from the south to the north. The specifically ecological face of imperialism basically is about unequal access to rents, unequal access to clean environments, and the under reproduction of peripheral life. That is, people in the third world living worse lives, comparatively speaking, in relation to the quality of their environment than people in the north. And again, this is very well documented, and we see it in a myriad of ways. There's a greater exposure to natural disasters, worse and worse under global warming. There's a greater exposure to environmental toxins, pesticides, industrial waste. We know about how the EU is exporting garbage to Turkey, how the EU exports pesticides or uses pesticides that are no longer legal in the EU and uses them in North Africa. We also know how the third world workforce that migrates to the north, for example, that works in northern agribusiness, which tend to be undocumented Chicano workers, for example, are overexposed to illegal pesticides. The third world is also much more exposed to deforestation with concomitant health effects, and overall is having worse health outcomes as a result. That is, because of the price system, they're not the commodities people in the third world produce are not remunerated, are not paid at a cost sufficient to allow for the production of the environment, right? And this then leads to worsening health outcomes. And this is part of imperialism. And this is how what we call ecologically unequal exchange, which actually refers to an umbrella of phenomena, right? Manifests at the level of the environment and at the level of what Marxists call value. Now, just specifically, there's also other forms of ecological devastation that are intimately linked to imperialism. One, at the level of production, there's a massive diversion of the physical productive base, north and south, to armaments, which is a diverted surplus. That is, instead of the surplus going towards basic needs or going to things that basically expand worldwide lifespan, for example, increase free time and so forth, they go towards the production of weapons, which is a form of waste that is imposed on the South by the North, right? Potentially, it's also a point of convergence between first and third world labor if first world labor is willing to destroy the military-industrial plant, right? Second of all, we see the ecological devastation of imperialism in the destruction of the ecology in Palestine, Syria, Iraq, very vividly, the recent destruction of oil depots in Iran, which led to oil flowing through the sewer system of Iran, then going on fire. And these are having ecological consequences, which will be registered for decades, right? And then finally, the denial of a planning capacity. That is, for example, the process of war that is imposed on the third world can actually rip apart ecological planning capacity. Very vividly, this occurred, for example, in the remediation programs that were put in place during the production of the Aswan Dam in Egypt. There were plans for soil remediation. They could not be implemented because of resource diversion that occurred because of the US-Israeli 1967 war inflicted on the people of Egypt and elsewhere. Or we can look at the very underread and critically important work of Danny Faber on the Sandinista revolution, where there was actually an ecological revolution alongside the social revolution in the 1980s. And in fact, very directly, you saw the diversion of cadres from there to the task of national self-defense, right? And this process of undermining of people's or revolutionary movements' ability to do ecological planning occurred through the process of US-sponsored Contra-insurgency itself, right? You see this on perhaps a lesser scale through the destruction of seed banks at Qarda in Syria, for example, right? As a result of the US proxy war persecuted against this country, most vividly since 2011, although Black Ops started before then. That is, we cannot separate between the ecology and imperialism, and we cannot separate between the ecological question and imperialism. So this brings us to a few organizing categories that I think are helpful, especially to the extent that this audience is in the North, which I think it is. It reminds us that national liberation is both a mental, ideological, and also political organizing category. That is, the sovereignty regime, which is one way of talking about the interstate system, is a prerequisite for organizing any discussion about eco-socialist transition and is a prerequisite for an eco-socialist transition. It's a very simple point, but it is unrealistic to expect that countries are going to put in place and converge on ecological planning policies in a North-South dialogue if there's not national sovereignty in those states. That is, you need the container of a safe and secure state, which is also a working class interest in general. It's a working class interest not to be bombed, in order to carry out an eco-socialist transition and in order for people in the South and people in the North to converge on an ecological program. That is, you cannot have a North-South dialogue when the North is bombing the South. So what does the Southern face of this struggle look like, a struggle for eco-socialism? It looks like ecologically modulated or ecologically aware sovereign industrialization, right? That is, the development of the necessary machine tools to be able to produce what is needed for both either nationally or probably regionally. It rests on agrarian reform, that is breaking up the large estates and also putting in place relatively more agroecological forms of production. The most famous example of this is Zimbabwe, which is subjected to asphyxiating sanctions, right? It's also of note that more recently Zimbabwe has moved to a lot of ecological forms of ecological and climate kind of smart forms of farming on the farms that have been the beneficiary of the agrarian reform, which broke the back of the white settler agrarian structure. All of this, of course, is part of national liberation, that is freeing the development of the national productive forces. And it is, of course, part of delinking, which is setting in motion a process of subjecting all of the external relations, the external economic and political relations, to an internal logic based on popular will and popular needs, including the fulfillment of basic needs. In the North, of course, there are also things to do. There's still a need for the decommodification of all necessary services, improvements in the quality and ecological lightening of all forms of production, from health, infrastructure, consumer goods, to agriculture and energy. And I wrote about this a lot in my book. The technologies more or less exist. They need development, but a lot of them exist. And of course, if social resources were actually devoted to the research into the necessary technologies, then obviously you can have a better quality of life and you can have relatively less labor devoted to the realm of necessity. But overall, there are even the currently existing technologies are sufficient for a very high quality of life north and south. The problems are political. The northern face of the struggle, however, also has to include anti-imperialism, which consistently disappears from northern ecological discourse. Um, and it also includes demilitarization because the North does not face self-defense needs, the South does, and the repayment of the climate debt, which means reparations, knowledge transfers, technology transfers, and so forth. And there is, I think Greta Thunberg put this very well. It's a system talking about the Northern capitalism. It's a system defined by colonialism, imperialism, oppression, and genocide. And this is something we need to keep in mind when we think about ecological transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. So I think both speakers raised some really important issues, and there are some overlaps also between what the two speakers are trying to emphasize here. So I'm going to just follow up with some questions to both speakers, and we're going to have a quick panel discussion before we open the floor to the audience here. So I'm gonna first raise the question to John. I think John, in your books and also in the talk just now, you discussed this conflict between workers and environment in general, and especially in the global South, where sometimes the only available jobs are often provided just by capitalists and are often carbon intensive and ecologically damaging by nature. You call it labor blackmailing, right? You mentioned several terms to describe this kind of dilemma and conflict. And you mentioned that sometimes environmental and labor activists can appear to have a conflict of interest. There seems to be a similar debate in the global north as well, where workers in the traditional fossil fuel sectors are worried about losing their jobs and pensions when grain transitioning is happening, when worried about them not having sufficient skills to transition into the new industries. And so there were a lot of resistance also based on that reasonable concerns. So how can we make sense of this dilemma? I know you talked a lot in your talk just now, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that, especially from the perspective of both the global South and also the global North working class, in terms of the possibility or the impossibility of reconcile this tension? And I think there are also there was an audience, I think, in the chat room mentioning about a point that you just touched on in your talk about labor aristocracy. And there are a lot of saying about how labor aristocracy is no longer a relevant concept. Do you want to also maybe comment a little bit on that? Thank you.
Well, I don't know how one could say labor aristocracy isn't a relevant concept. It's more relevant now than it probably ever has been, and because as Max said, you know, the conditions of workers are in the North are much better. The and they're, but not all workers. I mean, it's very divided. Like there's just statistics that came out in Canada the other day that said the 1% at the top in Canada own more than 80% at the bottom. And it's similar in the United States, but you have the labor aristocracy. The way I look at it is in Lenin's terms, which it doesn't apply to all labor. It applies to privileged workers, and often these conservative unions, the labor leaders, are really part of the system, and they've supported the Cold War and the new Cold War, and have been actually opposed to workers organizing in many respects, against grassroots workers organizing. So you have a split in the working class. On one hand, the real wages for workers in the United States are back where they were in the 1970s. They haven't increased for 50 years. On the other hand, you still have this, really pretty corrupt business unionism at the top. And that certainly is a labor aristocracy. The mistake is to apply it to the whole working workforce. And Lenin said that in face of the labor aristocracy, you have to go deeper. You have to go into you have to approach the mass of the workers, as opposed to the labor aristocrats. And then when you look at this situation globally, of course, we can't ignore the fact that the the AFL-CIO is not protesting. I mean, it said that it says that the war on Iran deviates from that international law, but what they say can barely be considered a protest against the war. It stays within Democratic Party channels. If you're, and in these circumstances, you can't pretend that the top of the labor movement in the United States isn't the kind of labor aristocracy tied into imperialism. So it's just a reality we have to deal with. And Engels first introduced the labor aristocracy issue to explain why workers in England in his day weren't more revolutionary. And he said, well, there's a spectrum of the workers that are gaining from colonialism and from the British hegemony. And this is the kind of situation we find. In terms of the other part of the question, it's really a great contradiction when you look at the global South. You look at in the Congo, the workers are digging cobalt with picks and shovels, and the benefits are going to multinational corporations, but they're breathing in the cobalt dust. They're getting it on their skin. They're dying from this. It's enforced by military, interventions in the Congo, perpetual warfare being generated by the global North. And the cobalt is being then used in the high tech in the North. And we're saying, the answer is to bring in alternative energy, solar, wind, all of these things, all of our technological devices, but they need cobalt, and we're exploiting workers in the Congo who have no alternative. They have no other place that they can work, no other way of surviving. So an environmentalism that ignores, that says, oh, well, we'll just go for alternative energy, and ignores what's happening in the global South. Look at the lithium mines. Look at at Bolivia and lithium. We basically we basically engineered a coup in Bolivia to get hold of the lithium. That is, the United States, Washington did. And for every ton of lithium, you need some god awful amount of I think it's like 2 million liters of water. And this is like bringing down the water table. It's taking the water populations need. We have to understand that even, that you can't, as Max said, you can't really have an environmental policy in the North that says, well, alternative energy is the solution. without recognizing that a lot of this is based on the super exploitation of the global south, the ecological expropriation of resources there. And, in terms of the North, yeah, it's the job blackmail is is very big, and the unions haven't fought this severely enough. The they're the the unions, the big unions in the United States, the AFL-CIO is embroiled in Trump's um, whole notion of digging oil, perpetually. And what is it? He forgot the phrase yesterday, and now I'm confused. But dig, baby, dig, or something like that. But the whole notion of like building up the fossil fuel industry, the unions are behind that, despite the environmental consequences, and going against it means that they run into the job blackmail. That's why I talk about the environmental proletariat. I mean, I think our hope lies in basically material conditions are deteriorating across the board, and people are going to learn what materialism means again. They already know it in the global south, and they're increasingly going to learn in the global north. But we talk about the working class movement as though it's only involved with jobs and factory jobs, and that's all they're concerned with, wages and blue collar industry and so on. And the truth is that the working class, insofar it is a class, is concerned with the entire nature of life, and with their urban conditions, their housing, the access to food and water and basic necessities and so on. And this is becoming an issue everywhere. And the environment, materialism in terms of the environment and materialism in terms of the economy are kind of merging. If people don't have food, they don't say, well, is this because of the economy or is this because of the environment? The two merge together. It's usually both. And we're increasingly going to see a struggle of working people, working class people, the environmental proletariat, so to speak, that is forced to deal with these issues simultaneously. They can no longer be boxed off from each other. And that's when you really get revolutionary movements. And you're already seeing that all over the global south. The global north is going to increasingly learn this too. So the narrow spectrum of labor union activity, as it's defined today, can't really sustain that, and it will have to broaden or cease to exist. It will have to respond to the needs of working people everywhere, or or it will become dysfunctional, useless, and will not help us out of this global ecological crisis.
Thank you so much, John, for clarifying your point and for providing more details on some of the points that you made in the talk. So I'm going to now switch to Max. And Max, the question for you, I think you laid out very clearly in your talk just now and also in your book that a program based on universal access to renewable energy, climate debt repayments, and decommodified public goods would fundamentally disrupt existing systems of production, which is capitalism and imperialism. And you also made an important, to my mind, very important point about how a prerequisite to eco-socialism is for the global South countries to have national sovereignty. And so I wonder, and I know you discuss basically your take on what the global north should be doing and what the global south should be doing. And you also talked about the difference between a flat capitalism and a polarized capitalism in terms of their take on which working class would be the leading class for revolutionary changes. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on how should we think about the role of workers and trade unions in this kind of transition? And in particular, how can labor movement engage with a project that may be deeply transformative and potentially disruptive to existing jobs and industries? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very important question, and I think it depends on the labor union at a certain level, and because labor unions are strategically and ecologically inserted in global production in different ways. To take the extreme example, workers' control of Lockheed Martin is not something I'm interested in, right? And it would be foolhardy to expect the workers in Lockheed Martin to overthrow their own firm or to carry out like a Lucas plan, which was a plan for the kind of conversion of ecologically destructive to production to kind of worker-controlled, ecologically sustainable production. It was never implemented. So it depends, right? We really have to think about it depends. I mean, and I think that it's unfortunately there is, because of the metabolic rift, there's very often a fundamental alienation between the process of, say, industrial production and the ecological consequences of industrial production. And secondly, even where there's not, it is often extremely difficult to balance the needs of the sectoral needs of unions with the kind of more general need, even of a municipal, let alone national working class. Again, I'll take an example I know, which is Tunis and Gabes, where there has been a catastrophe associated with the phosphate plant. At a certain level, there's been a catastrophe. That is, in the neighborhoods adjoining the phosphate plant, and Gabes is a maritime oasis in southern Tunisia. In the neighborhoods adjoining the phosphate plant, you have rates of cancer 10 times the expected rates of kidney cancer and liver failure, liver cancer. You have problems with bone density, bones that break and don't heal. And more recently, you have kind of toxic chemical fumes coming directly from the plants, and people are actually literally choking. Now, traditionally, or in the history of environmental mobilization, it was actually totally separated from the working class. More recently, there's kind of a more wide-ranging movement that has included some sector of the actual working class that's working in that phosphate plant itself. And at least one of the demands, anyway, it wasn't implemented, so it doesn't matter that much, was to just get rid of the phosphate manufacturing plants. If the phosphate manufacturing plants in Tunisia were just removed, right, in the current situation, the country would be in an economic depression, right? The overall people would suffer a huge amount economically. The country would lack the hard currency. It would spiral into an out of control economic situation, right? So I think it's just an example of the difficulty of the great difficulty of and because I don't want to give an answer to a false answer. I want to rather, I think it's more useful to kind of provoke some questions that I think are helpful for people to work through in concrete situations. I don't think this question of what unions can do is generalizable, and I don't think it's straightforward, and I don't think it's necessarily easy. And I don't think it can actually be derived really from at the level of theory, right? I think it has to be derived from a concrete practice. And I think unions need to be engaged in a political struggle also, right? That is, to take the Tunisian example, right? There is a possibility of getting rid of the phosphate installations or modernizing them, either way, so that they deal appropriately with their ecological waste. In If you are forcing the political system to invest in their modernization and dealing with the waste, or of a form of an overall economic planning system, a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a series of 5-year plans that are shifting the overall country's system of production, right? Um, if you aren't, and what I think that one can generalize from that case, right, is that extremely often the problem is that ecology and short-term economic interest are setting workers against other workers, or workers in the industrial sector against other workers, um, as they apprehend or understand their interests on an immediate basis. And there is a lack of a party as articulator, right? To some, to be very old school, to some the general interest of the working class, or articulate a general interest of the working class that can help people see beyond these short-term horizons that are totally rational, right? It would be very stupid to say people are being stupid. In fact, people are making very rational decisions, like they don't want their kids to starve, and someone else doesn't want their kid to be infected with cancer, to be afflicted with cancer. These are real issues that have to be dealt with at the level of a political organization and plan and proposal that can transcend these interests that are sectoral and partial in the interest of a broader synthesis. And I think this is something we have to think about when if we are doing organizing or education or so forth, to say that the union struggle can't really be separated from the broader political struggle, right? Even though at any given moment, of course, unions could have determinant roles to play in terms of pushing for transitions towards renewables on the one hand, or at the political level, like our comrades in Italy have done a fairly good job at carrying out either general strikes or refusing to load weapons to Israel or Saudi Arabia, for example, right? So there are concrete things to do for unions based on how they are inserted in the overall system of production and the overall pollution causing system. But um, I think that it's very important that we keep in mind the overall political framework, and we keep in mind the overall political framework that offers a possible north-south convergence, because a lot of the union discussion, unfortunately, in the North, or the people propagandizing to or about or ventriloquizing unions, is often based on sidestepping the North-South contradiction. And we need to find ways to move beyond that, which also means popular education, right? Maybe people don't know about these things. And that's something that is very important also. So those are kind of some general problematics. I don't want to talk beyond my knowledge or expertise and go beyond that, really.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the very thoughtful answer, Max. I keep thinking that when I was discussing with my colleagues and also my students, I realize a lot of the debates and arguments are about climate change among the left, actually, are resulting from making arguments on different levels. I mean, sometimes we're arguing from the theoretical perspective, sometimes we're arguing from the policy perspective, sometimes from the organizing perspective. And it seems like if we're engaging discussion from different perspectives, sometimes it would lead to different conclusions. On the theoretical level, I think a lot of us in this room would agree that radical changes are necessary. But on the policy level, sometimes, even the insufficient policies like Green New Deal probably is still better than retreating from the Paris Agreement, for instance. And on the organizing level, like you said, it really depends on the concrete situation you're involved in. Are we talking about global north or south? Are we talking about workers in the fossil fuel industry or in the renewable sector in the north? Or are we talking about like people like John was mentioning, I have no other choice except working in extractive industries, right? So I think these are all very, very concrete and realistic concerns that we need to address case by case. So we're now, let's turn to the audience, because I see some very much relevant points related to what we are just discussing. Particularly question by Phil and also Lance, I think. I found it very interesting that one question was from the Global North perspective and the other was from the South, but essentially similar. So I'm going to just read out, and I'll invite John and Max to share their thoughts on it. So Phil says, in Cornwall, we are seeing a boom in green industrial growth, potential big offshore wind developments, river dredging to expand the docks, achieve this, and tin and lithium mining. The need for renewable energy is at the forefront of building legitimacy for this growth, while as reality is expanded capacity for the arms industry and growth in tourism, bigger and more cruise ships. The docks expansion will destroy the local fishing industry, but bring some new jobs and apprenticeships in the docks. How do we create space for critique of this growth in a place that has felt left behind for decades? So this is actually a question from the Global North perspective, but I saw Lance actually raise a very similar question. He said, how do you organize workers in the Global South toward the issue of climate and environment when the primary issue they face remains to be wages, livelihood, and democratic rights? How can we make workers more class conscious about climate while the immediate interests of the worker remain to be wages, livelihood, and democratic rights? So I wonder if any of you would like to start answering.
Well, I know Cornwall pretty well. I've, been going there every other year, at least until COVID. And yeah, it's good that in a lot of ways that there is development of wind power and alternative offshore energy and so on. But Cornwall has been, yeah, relatively, it's been a periphery within England, and it has a lot of distinct cultural and natural elements that could be quickly destroyed, and the local fishing industry is being destroyed. Of course, tourism is being changed. It's all driven by capitalism and by the market and profit making, and very little of it is actually driven by local needs. And of course, the military is very big in Cornwall. So I don't know what the answer is. I mean, the answer is, well, the answer is socialism or eco-socialism, but the immediate question of, how do you resist? I think you need to create labor community alliances. And I don't really know. I haven't seen that kind of organization in Cornwall when I've been there, but it's not heavily politicized. But you need unions, labor to come together with communities and build alliances where they can define environmental requirements, and this has to be done on an eco-socialist basis. There has to be room for regional planning and resisting market criteria. And as Max says, there has to be decommodification. There also is, why is, Cornwall such a, base for the military? I mean, I guess we know geographically why that is the case, but I think to resist these things nowadays, you have to oppose the military, or you're not really taking a coherent environmental stance. So all of these things would enter in.
Thank you, John. Max, would you like to also add some points?
Yeah, sure. So um, the there's there's kind of this idea that people in the South are looking for growth or development, and this is in conflict with the climate issue. And I think I'm not sure how much I agree with this actually. I mean, going back to the 1970s, there were very extensive Southern um, debates on alternative development in Latin America and the Arab region, in Africa, um, in South Asia, that were looking at alternative technological paths that were comparatively light, comparatively more localized. And this is distinct from a kind of hippie type intermediate or appropriate technology debate. That's something else entirely, which was kind of based on the idea that heavy machine tools, and I should say nuclear weapons, should not be in the South. I'm in favor of the South having nuclear weapons, to throw that in there. There's not another way to protect yourself from America. But there was this idea of these kind of alternative technological paths in agriculture, in energy development, in production for basic needs, combined, and the term was combined technology, combined with the heavy forms of industrial production, machine tools, and so forth, right? Now, that has come and gone, right? But if those paths had been taken, the South would have never exceeded its kind of the what we call the kind of its safe per capita carbon budget. And here you can find a lot of work, for example, from Jason Hicko and his team, who have done work on how much countries have used of a kind of just, safe, theoretical carbon budget on a historical and per capita basis, right? And the work has basically shown that basically the entire third world is well below. It's still using below the amount of carbon that of the amount of carbon dioxide atmospheric space that would be safe to have kept the temperature at like 0.5 or 0 degrees warming, right? China now is a bit over, although I don't take the Chinese numbers seriously for the simple reason that China has had to build up a very substantial industrial system in order to defend itself again from America, which I keep coming back to, but it seems very much relevant today that countries need to protect themselves from America. And similarly, Russia is over. That's because of the Soviet industrial defense base, which was used to beat the Nazis. So again, for me, this is irrelevant. But in fact, even now, these countries had no need to go over their carbon budget to achieve basically reasonable standards of reasonable standards of living and to supply basic goods to their population. And even now, the technological system is far more advanced. But if you again bracket the issue of defensive industrialization, that is military industrialization, and the armaments that are necessary to defend yourself, the technology exists because it's much more advanced than it was in the 70s and 80s to actually to have enough development. Forget the word growth, enough development to provide basic needs for the population vis-a-vis food, housing, healthcare, and so forth. The speed is a different issue, and that's where you might need polluting techniques, but the technology exists. Now, the climate issue, people are aware of it, On the other hand, it's in fact sometimes here in Tunisia, things are called climate that are not climate. Like people cannot get access to water infrastructure, and then they're told that the issue it's a climate issue, and it's like no, there's not enough water infrastructure. The state hasn't invested properly in water infrastructure, in part because of the onerous conditions placed on it after the revolution by the IMF, or the uprising after the IMF. This is not even a climate issue, right? But of course, everyone is acutely aware of the climate issue, and in fact, but the climate issue is basically a northern issue, right? The North is the one that is continuing to not only overpollute, but underinvest in renewable energy transitions, let alone offering renewable energy technology to the South, whereas it's China that's offering what Praveen Parasiaro Samoil called a kind of industrial lifeboat that is capable, we'll see what it requires struggle, but that is actually capable of being a form of technology that could be offered on terms to the South that would allow for energy transition. I mean, even with what's happening in Cuba, which is catastrophic, I mean, even with the contradictions of the Chinese policy towards Cuba, Cuba is building up solar with Chinese assistance at a simply astounding rate, right? It's, I think, maybe the fastest percentage increase in solar buildup. It's based of need, but it's still happening. And in fact, the only time you see these types of transitions are when countries do it based on need. They don't do it. No country's doing it from this kind of like pure ecological consciousness. So I don't see any issue. I see no contradiction for the development, or if we want to call it growth, I don't care. And the climate issue in essence. And I view that as in fact, a northern problem and a northern problem of, again, decommodification and anti-imperialism.
Thank you, Max. This reminds me of something, some data that I saw long ago, and I've also put in my paper, which is that if we are to lift out hundreds of millions of people from extreme poverty, its impact on carbon emission would be less than 1% of the total global emission. And that's way less than what could potentially be saved by maybe owning one less private vehicle in the global north, right? So I think this kind of asymmetry is still pretty astounding. I'm gonna keep reading out questions from the Q&A, and also just to remind audience that if you are actually asking questions, instead of just posting your comments, please make sure the questions are posted in the Q&A window instead of the chat window. But if you have just comments and you're just talking to each other, then please make sure you're sharing those posts in the chat window. So I saw again 2 parallel questions about the changing nature of the working class. So I'm gonna read it out together. The first one is from Lee Cash. Lee said, the climate emergency demonstrates that many unions are structured around 19th century models of organization in 21st century economies. A labor aristocracy representing fewer and fewer workers, 6% in the US. Are new forms of worker organization emergent in the US, something akin to social movement unionism or worker coalitions organizing around single issues. And I think a very similar question is from Lance, raising the importance of climate question to industrial workers is important, but how do you raise the importance of the climate question to service workers like BPO industry or to the semi-proletariat? John or Max, would any of you like to take the question?
Well, I mean, I agree that the union structure is not the kind of structure that we need to deal with present day problems, and that it has a 19th century model. And if we can't go backward into that model, we have to try to transform unions and the labor movement. The working class movement, as Max is saying too, is way bigger than the unions. The unions are important, and we hope that more workers would be unionized. But in the United States, with in the entire private sector, only 6% of the workers are unionized. If you're going to talk about the working class, you're not just talking about unionized workers. And we have these enormous changes occurring now. The neo-fascism and it's developing eco-fascism in the United States are a product of declining U.S. hegemony, the weakening of the entire U.S. economic systems, system, its vulnerabilities, the capitalist class basically organizing the lower middle class into a a reactionary, neo-fascist movement, which then supports uh, a major regime change within the state, a shift from liberal democracy to fascism is happening in the United States. There's an enormous struggle over that. But all this is connected to things like climate change, even though they would deny it, the need to control resources. And look at the AI transformation. 80% of U.S. investment or U.S. private domestic expenditure in the first half of 2025 was on AI and data centers. In the 19th century, then during the railroad boom, the railroads took up 25% of the investment. Now 80% of the investment is in AI, these and data centers that some of them are 1 million square feet. And this is a massive, massive shift and people are organizing against it. It's mostly working class opposition, oppositions from local areas. They say that the head of Microsoft um, said that all white collar workers will be eliminated in about 18 months. That's an exaggeration, but they're going after the workforce in ways that we've never seen before. Bernie Sanders is talking about the loss of tens of millions of jobs. So we're the working class is in a crisis, which is part of a bigger crisis. And we don't actually know how this is going to shape up. It's both an environmental crisis and an economic crisis at the same time. But it's going to blow apart the current union structure or make it more and more dysfunctional. There has to be a reconstitution of our basic structures of resistance if we're going to fight in this period. And a lot of people are kind of depressed about it and see it as a kind of technological determinism. They think of AI as completely eliminating human beings. It's not like that at all. It's a social construct, and it may be, there are good aspects to, there are aspects that might create global movements. They're going to displace jobs more in the center of the system and create jobs in the periphery. There won't be good jobs, but there is a situation where the working class in the center is now under attack, and maybe that will create the basis for a more global movement. At any rate, we're in a period of enormous transition, and I think that we need to think in terms of that. We need to be at the forefront of it and see what other kinds of political and economics and movement structures that we can create that will bring people together in opposition to this. But we've never seen anything like the disaster that transformations that are occurring now at the behest of capital. We got this AI happening and a war on Iran, and they're using AI to launch 2,000 sites a day in Iran. All of these things are connected, and as Max said at one point, we need political organization. The unions have to be connected to political organization. We need some kind of party development of some, we need that kind of political movement to bring these struggles together. So that's what I'm thinking about at the present time.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Max, would you also like to share thoughts on this one or for the next question? Because I saw a lot of questions directly to you. So yeah, let us know if you want to answer this one.
No, I'll go with the ones directly to me.
Okay, great. Okay. So I saw questions about agriculture and land use. I think you have an entire chapter in your book about that. So I'm going to read out this question from David. David said, with the required land reform, oh, basically it is required land reform needed, right, for agricultural transitions. What is the role of agroecologists in the global north, research and advocacy wise, during the current period?
So I think that there's some very interesting agroecological outcomes going on a world scale, and very interesting findings in relation to agroecology and yield, agroecology and productivity. There's some very successful outputs from Cuba in this respect. And there are also even more interesting findings in relation to agroecology, as I think probably the person who asked me knows very well, in relation to climate resilience, that is, resilience and recovery after the extreme weather events that are getting more and more frequent. So I think agroecologists in the North, and again, this is easier to say and do. One can think about what is going on locally in terms of thinking about what a local transition looks like, right, in relation to land use planning and local agriculture and local food sheds. And of course, there's always a risk that this type of kind of local and we can say economistic organizing ends up very isolated from larger political questions. But I think, on the other hand, the situation is so bad in the North at this point that politically conscious people with a broader political orientation should be engaging in these local questions of planning, including getting into municipal governments if it's possible. It's like technical attaches and so forth, and getting into the nitty-gritty of ecological planning with relation to land use writ large, but also agroecology, agroecological transformations more narrowly. And I think there's a lot of kind of lighthouse attempts. There's the Iowa Land Trust, there's the Land Institute, and I think, again, it's a question of linking these up to broader political questions, which is kind of a popular education and also a propagandistic effort. And I have something a bit heterodox, or maybe that is important to keep in mind, is that the Iowa Land Trust, Ashwin, I believe. I believe that we also need to keep talking about agrarian reform very strongly, North and South, because I have a bit of an apprehension that breaking up the large capitalist agrarian system has been a little bit sidelined in favor of a focus on the forms of production, the technologies of production, namely agroecology. And I think we need to keep both, right? I mean, I think there is a lot to do in terms of a shift to agroecology. I think there's good arguments from a national productivity and anti-imperialist perspective for agroecological transitions north and south. But I also think we need to keep the agrarian reform issue front and center is one thing, because honestly, the Zimbabwe example is our one example of successful land to the tiller, and also anti-racist agrarian reform over the last 35 years. And it's very poorly known, right? And it's actually a lot of discussion of it was embargoed. And it's not a question of like just knowing. It's inspiring to know that people won, actually. That's really important. And that's not someone else's win, right? That's our win, right? I mean, we want to redistribute the means of production to the popular classes. Well, the Zimbabweans did it, right? So I think we need to keep that very much in mind. And in fact, so I'm not, in fact, I'm not sure if that directly answered the question itself, because the questioner may have meant different things by that question. But those are just some general things I think about these days when I'm thinking about the agroecological movement.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with what you just talked about. I recently was teaching development course, and I was discussing the very topic that you were just mentioned, agrarian change. And I went through with my students about agrarian history of a lot of the countries and economies. And we all see that industrial takeoff usually happens after progressive land reform. And this speaks to the experience of South Korea and Taiwan, let alone mainland China. So this is, I think, very much dismissed in the current discussion of economic development. John, I wonder if you want to share your thoughts on this question as well, because I know you've been working with Rob Wallace on industrial agriculture and its impact on ecology and public health. Would you like to share a few thoughts, or would you like to move on to the next question? Your choice.
Well, I'll just say that that agribusiness is really the enemy, of any kind of meaningful agrarian reform in the global South, and the World Bank has been leading the promotion of agribusiness since the early 1990s, at least, and promoting this idea that eliminating subsistence agriculture is always a sign of progress, and move the subsistence agriculture, the peasants off the land, depeasantize, and that's the key to development. But the problem is that, I mean, they justified that in terms of their global poverty line. They said that a billion people were below the global poverty line when they first introduced this in 1992. So we have to eliminate that global poverty. But what that meant was those billion people below the global poverty line were those engaged in subsistence agriculture, which they weren't in the market at all. And if you move those people off the land and give the land to agribusiness, and we've seen the greatest depeasantization taking place in all of history in places like Africa, and people end up in slums in the global South, and maybe they do have $2 a day, but they're more impoverished because they don't have access to food, because their connection to the land, to food, to their own reproduction has been severed, and they need money to mediate everything, and so they're in far worse shape. So we have to recognize this structural reality. And of course, this is tied to agrarian reform too. But you have to remember that where there is subsistence agriculture, maybe that's something to build upon rather than to eliminate in many cases. For example, in China, they built on the strengths of their agriculture rather than simply demolishing it. So this is very important in any kind of analysis of development.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Next question I'm going to read out is for Max specifically. A question is regarding growth and global south. Is climate change not a main issue in the global south as well, given that it will be most affected? And what role for elites in the global south as well, who are focused on growth for profits, capitalism, as well, instead of well-being?
Well, let me just say, that I agree with Max that the problem is mainly a northern problem, and that the way we looked at it, climate change, is that the first issue was mitigation, to mitigate climate change. But people in the global south weren't responsible for climate change. It was the global north that sees most of the global climate budget. I mean, almost all of it, and that is responsible for the most of climate change. And we know that if you looked, and this is something that Max had in his PowerPoint, that if we look towards equal per capita energy use in the world, the data suggests that's pretty much around Spain and Italy. Spain and Italy are not really impoverished nations. It isn't like you live like the Italians or the Spanish that you're going to be suffering. But the world needs to be able to converge to that level. The United States uses gargantuan amounts of energy per capita. And that's why, talking about degrowth or decommodification or whatever how we want to refer to it, is important in terms of a nation that, like the United States, that is so wasteful and destructive and uses so much more energy per capita. So some countries, some rich countries, they have to reduce their energy per capita. That can be done while improving the conditions of people because of problems of distribution and waste and so on. Other countries, like in the global south, most global south countries need to develop. Hopefully, they can develop in more sustainable ways than the Western model, but they need development, and they're way below the level of an equilibrium per capita energy use. So they need to be able to have that. So I think it's really important to understand that and in the global south, you could say the climate problem is a more serious issue, but it's more serious because um, because of geography, regional disparities, poverty, and so on. The effects are hitting the global south hardest, but they aren't responsible for the mitigation. It's the global north that has really the responsibility for the mitigation because they created this and they're still creating it. And so for the global south, it's more a question of directly a question of survival. So these are different issues depending on the different positions in the world, and it's really a product of imperialism. So imperialism ends up being the fundamental problem in terms of the global environment as a whole.
Thank you, John. Actually, the question was direct to Max just now, so let me just re-emphasize the question to Max also. I think the audience
Yeah.
also wanted to hear what role for elites in the global south are playing, in terms of focusing on growth instead of well-being. But let me also bring up another question direct to you, Max, which is what are your thoughts on the movement Semterra in Brazil? Is it a model movement that can be replicated elsewhere in the global south, especially MST's green agenda, its alignment with the urban working class in Brazilian cities? Thank you.
Sure. So first, this question of elites. I mean, another way to put it, I guess, would be, does the global South have a capitalist class contradiction? And absolutely, right? Um, and of course, it's integrated with imperialism, but there's challenges related to consumption. There's patterns of consumption going back to the 1960s that have certain forms of kind of emulative consumption on the part of the rising middle, upper middle, or upper classes in the third world were propelling ecological destruction in the South and also forms of agricultural modernization that were much more beneficial for the larger farmers. We can talk about the Green Revolution as one example. Betting on the strong precipitated a lot of ecological damage that went hand in hand with the existence of agrarian capitalism in third world countries, right? Because, in fact, smaller peasants weren't really involved in green revolution technologies very often. They couldn't afford them, and that is where agroecology remains as in the form of that term is not necessarily used, but most peasants in the South would have a foot in traditional agriculture anyway. So it's clear, I think, that an ecological transition in the South goes hand in hand with a form of popular development. I mean, you take something very simple. It's sort of taken for granted, I think, in Europe, not in America where I'm from, that something like public transportation, right? A lot of the South has inadequate or non-existent forms of public transportation, which are less polluting, um, are more efficient, would remove, for example, would rely on more social or socialist or socializing form of public investment, that is, forms of mass transit rather than investment in road infrastructure, which relies on private cars, and then leads to profits for the car importers, right, which are or the car manufacturers, but primarily in a country like Tunisia and many other third world countries, car importers, right? And also eventually is very much linked to the petrodollar, right? Which is, and moving away from that also means moving away from car-based forms of transportation to more socialized forms of transportation. I mean, and you can go through sector after sector, right? And I did this in my book, looking at things like architecture, urban planning. It's not comprehensive, it's just some sketches of ideas, to be honest. But looking at things like agriculture, architecture, urban planning, alternative forms of industrialization for basic needs. In many of these sectors, you can have win-win solutions, right? You can have more socialized forms of investment or in production based on government investment, and you can have better ecological outcomes at the same time. And these will run against the interests of capitalist classes in the third world, 100%, right? I mean, it's not a coincidence that a disproportionate amount of third world infrastructure spending is going towards ever larger airports rather than public transportation infrastructure, right? That is a class issue, right? Now, of course, the North anyway is generally responsible for climate change, right? So I want to always keep that in mind when I talk about this. But nevertheless, this doesn't mean that more popular developmental paths in the South can also very easily be more ecological, can be more in the service of providing necessary basic needs to the people of the South, and will cut into the conspicuous consumption of southern the wealthier people in the South, or at least, and even more so, the forms of production that they are investing in and entrenched in, right? So I think these are all very important. And what was the second question? Sorry.
The second question is about the MST movement.
Sorry, yes. I mean, the MSD has a huge amount of people organized under its umbrella. I think it has done a great in its moments. It did a great job, and in certain pilot projects, like in Belo Horizonte, Jahi Chappelle wrote a fantastic book, Beginning to End Hunger, talking about how the Semtecha was also involved in uh, kind of provisioning for basic needs for the poor people of that city and really reducing hunger radically while also encouraging agroecological forms of production. So the Semtecha is very important. I mean, I don't know if they're models, right? That's one thing. And also there are critiques. We have to, I think the Semteja, like a lot of Latin American governments and movements, has been shocked by both the neoliberal and imperialist assault on hope, the assault on possibility, and has agrarian reform is not so much on their agenda anymore, right? I think this is so important to keep in mind, which is why, and I've had the benefit of learning this from my time with Agrarian South. I mean, this is why the Zimbabwe example is so important, because it put agrarian reform on the agenda. And for the Centeja, which is important and an organized force that will be part of any perspective anti-systemic transformation in Brazil, agrarian reform is not so much on the agenda. Rather, what's on the agenda is production on the land that they have recovered. It's significant, but I think the political edge, and moreover the further egalitarian political edge, which is necessary for a radical peasant movement, I think a lot of that has become less present. I'm not in a position to exactly say how that has happened, but I think it's part and parcel of the overall stalling out of under imperialist assault of the pink tide governments.
Thank you, Max. John, would you like to add anything or?
No,
Nope.
that seems
Okay, we have a lot of
right.
questions for you actually. Yeah, so I'll just read out the next ones then. So Ronald actually posted two questions, and his main concern is that whether the extensive damage to environment done by pre-capitalist societies can be used as a value-free focal point. So I think this is a question about Anthropocene versus Capitalocene. I wonder if anyone would like to take on that one.
What is extensive damage to pre-capitalist?
To the environment done by pre-capitalists. Basically, the point that so much environmental destruction has been wrought a millennia ago due to simple economic processes, not really mode of production. So I think it's a question about, Anthropocene versus Capitalocene.
Most class societies have carried out extensive environmental damage on a regional basis, in their localities, like you go back to Mesopotamia and so on. But they've affected regional areas. They've not affected the biosphere or the Earth system. It's only fairly recently, in the 1950s, with the Great Acceleration, that we have a situation where human beings or a human society has, via capitalism, of course, has become a force for change, the leading force, the main factor in Earth system change. And that divides the period from the 1950s on from previous history. So we now, what we do economically or in production is so large that it's affecting the Earth system as a whole. It's placed us in a different place, creating anthropogenic rifts in the biogeochemical cycles of the planet. So this is the problem of the Anthropocene. The regional environmental destruction and before played a role in the decline of Mesopotamia, even Rome and so on. But it's quite qualitatively different from the kind of situation we have now, which is a planetary crisis. I guess that's the best I can do with that.
Max, would you like to chime in on this one? No? Okay, that's fine. So we still have a lot of questions here. I don't think I can read out all because we only have 6 minutes left. I'm gonna just lump them all together. I saw 3 questions about labor organizing, unions, And I saw one question about public ownership, so I'm going to just read it out and I'll see whether John and Max would like to take on any of them. You don't have to answer all, you'll just maybe pick one or two that you would like to elaborate on, and also to maybe provide us some concluding remarks. There's one. The first one is we're looking to host a conference celebrating 50 years since the publication of the Lucas Workers Plan, and are thinking of using artificial intelligence as a lens. How should we frame our conference planetary to cut through the dismal contemporary mood and the rapid expansion of military production and huge data centers? The second one on labor organizing is any practical ideas about how to democratize unions and also organize larger parts of the workers? What role for relations with cooperatives as in the initial stages of unions? And the third one on similar theme is how do you strengthen collective action of workers toward climate action for unions amid neoliberal attacks on labor unions through rampant contractualization? Unions are important for sure, but because collective bargaining is often restricted for contract workers and the widespread practice of labor flexibilization, how do you include them in the struggle for climate justice? So these three questions are on the same theme. And then there's another one on ownership structure. With the acceleration of the pace of the crisis, the prospect of social and economic collapse, should the question of public ownership be foregrounded as it's China's state sector that is the core to energy and industrial transition? So feel free to pick any one or two questions you would like to elaborate on, and you can also provide some concluding remarks if you want. Who would like to start?
I'll say something. I mean, I can't answer all the organizational questions because, that those are things that have to be solved on the ground in particular situations, as Max was so good at explaining. But I do think we have to recognize that we're in a different age. And one of these things is the Anthropocene, which which is one way of talking about the Earth system crisis as a whole that affects us all, but is expanding very quickly, and we have this growth of neo-fascism, particularly in the center now, in the United States and parts of Western Europe, and we can see that now the military and imperialist effects on that. We have and it's very connected to a change in the forces of production with the development of AI and the requirements that provides. So I think that the most important thing, as Max says, we're in a late monopoly capitalism, but we have to begin to understand what is the nature of the age that we're in and the challenges, and how do we restructure our struggles in relation to that. We can no longer have an environmental movement that's separate from a labor movement, a peace movement that's separate from the labor environmental movement, a feminist movement that's off on its own. We have to somehow create a new class movement that unites all of these and is struggling against imperialism, but recognizes that the relation to production is changing and the system is fragile, it's vulnerable at this stage. We need to fight against AI before they, shove us into prisons and close the door, right? We have to struggle against these things while they're in the making. And so it's a different era. but that could be exciting. It's driving a lot of people to more revolutionary forms of thinking all over the world and to more revolutionary struggles. It's making eco-socialism more important. So we have both the threat and the possibility of more expansive struggles that unify people globally. That's all I can say.
Thank you so much, John. Max?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of the Lucas plan is self-explanatory, except when it comes to military production. I mean, how much can we realistically expect the people involved in military production to get on board these days, right? So it's going to be a Lucas plan through politics rather than Lucas plan through workers. I mean, I think that's very important. Less for framing, but for organizing and keeping in mind, like, is there a consciousness or even the potential for a consciousness for a Lucas plan with workers involved in the military sectors?
Thank you. Thank you, Max. All right. Thank you, John and Max, for speaking at length today. And also thank you, audience, for staying with us for 2 hours and raising really important questions. We really appreciate your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again in our future lecture series next academic year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I learned from the audience and from Max and everyone. This has been really informative for me.
Thank you, John. And we're going to be posting our recording also online and on YouTube, and we'll share links with the audience and also with you, John and Max, if you would find it useful for you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your participation. And thank you, Huani, for organizing the session.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.